All right. Today we're going to talk about the political and economic situation in the United States following the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1973. Of course, as you remember from last time, Richard Nixon resigned due to loss of political support in the wake of the Watergate scandal, which gave us Gerald Ford as president of the United States. Ford had a number of issues to overcome during his presidency. The first of which, of course, that no one actually voted for him. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and then ascended to the presidency because Nixon's vice president had resigned. So Ford is already operating on a super weak mandate. This was coupled with the fact that one of the first things he did during his presidency was pardon Nixon. He argued that Nixon had suffered enough. He thought that it would damage American credibility to have to go through a whole trial. And so he pardons Nixon, and the investigation into Nixon's crimes stopped. On the one hand, this is kind of necessary because it probably would have damaged American credibility to have to deal with this whole massive trial of a former president. But on the other hand, there's this sense that Ford is simply letting Nixon off the hook, and he basically got away with everything. So from the start, Ford is already in a really difficult position. Plus, he's not the most charismatic of guys, and he's not the most well-spoken, clever people. Lyndon Johnson, uh, Gerald Ford was a former football star at Michigan, and Lyndon Johnson had once described Ford by saying, "Jerry's a nice guy, but he played football before they wore helmets," basically implying that not the brightest of individuals. Ford also had to deal with the rising crisis of deindustrialization. The United States had been a manufacturing power during World War II, but from the 1950s onwards, slowly we started moving from a more industrial economy to a service economy. Employment in manufacturing decreased as automation increased, and this transforming of the workforce was really problematic for a lot of Americans, especially Americans living in what's called the Rust Belt. This is the area between along the northern Great Lakes region. Of course, you remember from earlier in this class, this became the industrial heartland of the United States during the Gilded Age, with cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and Detroit, Chicago, pumping out cars and rail cars and all of these, steel products and things like that. Well, production in the United States became more expensive, jobs started going overseas. A lot of these factories started either automating in order to increase their efficiency, or simply shuttering and moving to places where labor was cheaper. So a lot of these cities started losing a lot of their economic base, creating what was called the Rust Belt as these factories began to quote unquote rust. So shuttered factories is obviously problematic for a number of different reasons, of course. As jobs decrease, the amount of income in cities decreases, which compounds this problem. And you start to get this sense of urban decay as buildings sit unused, and it creates this sense that there's no economic prospects in a city, which lead to even more people fleeing, which sort of compounds this problem. And obviously a significant amount of outsourcing happens, and so as more factories begin outsourcing, it becomes easier to outsource, and factories start to locate to places like China, which provide cheaper labor. China during this time period had been undergoing a sort of capitalist revival that I'm sure you remember from your world history classes under Zhou Enlai and then later Deng Xiaoping. So China is becoming a massive manufacturing power as the United States manufacturing is to some degree ebbing. Of course, the society transforms. Not all these jobs go away, but as we switch to service sector jobs, it requires a very different skill set. And oftentimes, in the service sector, there's a massive divide between the people who have high levels of education and the people who don't, right? Because doctors are a service sector job, as is a greeter at Walmart. But the income for these two groups is very different. So if you can afford to go to college, this transformation of society is not going to affect you tremendously. However, if you can't, now the good paying factory jobs are becoming less common, whereas low paying service jobs are becoming more common. So all of these things are compounding, and this is not Gerald Ford's fault, but it is starting to all fall on him. This leads to a phenomenon known as white flight, as affluent, educated people begin to flee cities for suburbs and other areas, as they can now work from home, from they no longer have to be concentrated in city centers where manufacturing had previously happened. With this, of course, property values drop, as tax bases drop, taxes have to go up, services decrease, poverty increases, all of these things. You can pause and take a look at this chart. But of course, the problem is poverty, crime, all these things grow as affluent people flee cities, and we get this image of urban decay. It got so bad that you should pause the video and take a look at this. The police in New York released a guideline for people visiting Manhattan that basically said you need to be off the streets by 6 p.m. and you should not be carrying wealth with you anywhere, and you can't use public transportation. Take a moment and pause and look at this because it was utterly terrifying. So in 1975, New York almost declares bankruptcy. There's a sense that the city absolutely was going to run out of money, that New York City, the most affluent and the symbol of American prosperity, was going to basically go bankrupt. And Gerald Ford refused to bail the city out, causing even more consternation and a sense of a lack of leadership from the Ford administration. So, New York City on the verge of bankruptcy, Ford first refuses to bail them out and then says he'd veto any bill that Congress passes to bail them out. And then at the last minute capitulates and bails New York City out anyway. So all of this stuff together sort of shows Ford as kind of a waffler and not a particularly inspiring leader in general. Ford, as a Republican, of course, opposed what he saw as the sort of wasteful spending of these liberal urban centers and didn't want the federal government to bail New York out of its responsibilities, but in the end saw that like it would have been economically devastating for New York to declare bankruptcy, so ended up giving in. So it's not that the decisions were bad decisions. It's just that, again, the way that Ford approached it and the way that he dealt with it was somewhat problematic. In foreign policy, Ford inherited also just some terrible, terrible crises. The Yom Kippur War started under Nixon, but it was an attack by Egypt on Israel. Egypt, obviously, Israel, the creation of Israel led to a lot of issues in the Middle East, as I'm sure you remember from your world history class. There were a number of wars between the Arab nations of the Middle East and the Israelis. The United States traditionally helping support the Israelis. In the Yom Kippur War, Israel was pushed almost to the breaking point when an alliance of Syria and Egypt assaulted Israel from two sides. The United States ended up coming to Israel's aid, but the end result of this is the Arab world turned decisively against the United States. So, in the end, Israel wins the war, annexes the Sinai Peninsula, but the United States pays a tremendous cost for this because the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, is, of course, mostly controlled, or at least significantly controlled, by Middle Eastern countries, specifically Saudi Arabia, which is really the number one oil producer in the world and the sort of global leader in oil production. So, because of our support for Israel, the Saudis put an oil embargo on the United States and basically cut off our supply of oil, and significantly, of course, increased the price of gasoline. So we first immediate gas shortage, which is massively problematic. Uh, we're dealing with some shortages here in the age of the coronavirus, but imagine that like gasoline was running out and exactly how that would grind American society to a halt. There were massive lines for people to try to get gas. This is one of the gas lines that was common in the mid 1970s. People were limited to only a specific amount of gas, and the price of oil, of course, is going to skyrocket. You can see here it's this jump in price of oil, which created a number of different problems. Obviously, much more expensive, so it's going to hurt Americans economically, but it's also going to crush the American auto industry, which had focused on building large, powerful cars that were relatively fuel inefficient. Because of the high price of gas, Americans instead start buying Asian and European manufactured cars, specifically, South Korean and Japanese cars, Toyota and such, and then Volkswagens and German manufactured cars because they tend to be smaller and more fuel efficient, whereas American companies specialize in large trucks. So when oil price goes up, people tend to switch to more fuel efficient vehicles, which crushed the already struggling American auto industry. So the cards just keep the dominoes just keep falling for the Ford administration. So massive economic crisis, and Ford didn't really have a good answer for this. South Vietnam falls under the Ford administration. The ceasefire, quote unquote, that we had established between the North and the South collapses, as I think most people understood that it would. South Vietnam is overrun, and anyone who's trying to claim that the United States did not lose the Vietnam War now has a significantly harder time, as we have these horrifying images of the US desperately trying to evacuate people from Saigon before it falls to the communists. So that, negative, of course. And all of this leads to the perception that Ford is simply not up to the task. We'll talk about this later, but he is one of the first president. He is the first president to be parodied on a brand new show, Saturday Night Live, where Chevy Chase portrays him as a bumbling fool. And the general perception is he kept most of Nixon's architecture in place. There's Henry Kissinger, of course. And so there was a sense that like the Nixon administration was simply running a shadow presidency behind Gerald Ford, and that he was inept and kind of a figurehead at best and a puppet at worst. So, how do we feel about Gerald Ford? He's going to carry on a lot of Nixon's policies, but there's the sense that he doesn't get any credit for any of them. We do now continue to normalize relations with China and our relations with the Soviet Union, but there's a real sense that behind it all, it's mostly Nixon and detente, and Ford is there to look like the president. But we do get some arms limitation treaties under Ford. They had been started to negotiate under Nixon. The SALT Treaty was signed. As we talked about, it limits the amount of ballistic missiles that people can have. So, way to go, Gerald Ford. Again, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. There's a massive international incident where a American freighter, whose name I am not going to try to pronounce, is captured by Cambodian rebels. Cambodia had, of course, not Cambodian pirates, basically. I mean, yeah. Cambodia, as you hopefully remember from world history class, was destabilized over the course of the Vietnam War and fell to a communist regime led by Pol Pot, where the Khmer Rouge ended up executing a significant portion of their population. Well, this tanker is seized. We send in a rescue attempt, and it's hopelessly bumbled. And in the end, a helicopter crashes, and a bunch of soldiers die, and the Ford administration is further humiliated. So, still not good. And then a civil war breaks out in Angola, which is, of course, in the southwest part of Africa. So, in Angola, there is a northern part of Angola that is controlled by a communist regime, and a southern part of Angola that is theoretically capitalist and autocratic. So, Angola launches an assault into southwest Africa, and of course, hopefully, this seems somewhat familiar to you at this point. But we decide that we're going to not get involved in this war. So, this is the first major example of what's called Vietnam syndrome. And it's this idea that the Vietnam War was such a travesty and such a disaster for the United States that we're going to basically not get involved in these future foreign wars. We're going to be much less interventionist than we had been previously, because we were, of course, worried that any conflict we get involved in would become a quagmire like Vietnam and just drag us down into increasing levels of intervention to fight a fight that could not be won, or that we didn't have the political will to win, depending on who you talk to. So the Gerald Ford administration, not ideal at this point. Economic and foreign policy crises abound. And although, again, Gerald Ford did not cause these problems, he also was not able to adequately address them. And so, as the United States sort of veered or drifted listlessly towards the elections of 1976, there was a sense that we needed to do something different.